something that I believe is out there in my future that is going to cause me harm or pain, that it's a threat and it's creating this emotion in me that makes me feel like I'm going to lose something in the future. But there's a reason why we're talking about this. There's a reason that goes beyond just trying to know more about fear. No, what is the danger in your mind? What's the danger with fear? What's the problem with fear? Why is fear worth talking about? Because fear wants to control us. Fear is a mechanism. It's a thing that wants to have control over us. In fact, if you would, I would love for you to just think about what has fear kept you from doing? Some of you have a dream about your future. You have an idea that you want to try. You have a job you want to pursue. You have a relationship you want to pursue. Something that you would like to try, but fear has kept you from trying it because it has kept you from something. That's what fear does. And yes, fear has kept us from maybe causing harm to ourselves, but fear has also limited our ability to experience life because it's kept us from things. Fear has also, though, caused us to do some things that we regret as well, right? In fact, most people that feel smothered by someone, you feel smothered by that person because fear is driving them. If you feel micromanaged, or if you feel like someone is not making themselves available to you, that they're isolated, they've withdrawn themselves, and perhaps it's fear that has caused them to do that. But the same thing could be said of you and I, that we have done things that we wish we hadn't done, that we wish we didn't do. And it was motivated by this controlling thing inside of us called fear. I would imagine that there are people listening today, and you're done with fear. You're over fear. You're sick of fear. You're so tired of it keeping you from life and causing you to treat people, behave in ways that you wish you wouldn't. And then there's others of you that the low hum of fear has just gotten to be so common. It's kind of like the air conditioning running in a room. You've tuned it out. You don't even hear it because you've learned to cope with it. You've learned to deal with it. And maybe today is a day for you to wake up and go, hey, what has this fear kept me from? What has it caused me to do? And how can I begin to overcome this fear? What would you tell someone about overcoming their fears? Well, you would try to help them understand it. You try to help them play it out. And then you try to help them find courage or bravery to get over their fear. But see, I don't believe that's enough. I believe there's something powerful that can happen when we can understand fear, but also when we can understand this particular kind of love that our Creator has for us. That's what I want to talk about for the remaining moments we have together. There's a guy named John who followed very closely after Jesus. He was one of the 12 disciples. He's known as one of the apostles. He wrote an account of Jesus' life that we call John. He called himself the one whom Jesus loved. That's how he referred to himself. In his letter to other Christians, we've got a few of them, but in the first one, which we call 1 John, very dynamic creative meeting that they had to name that book, letter, he wrote this about fear. I find this fascinating, but listen to what he said in 1 John 4, verse 18. He said, there is no fear in love. He says, as you're thinking about the love that God has for us, there is no fear in this kind of love. He says, but I want to take it a step further. Perfect love actually drives out all fear. He says, there's no fear in love, but this perfect kind of only God kind of love, completely unconditional, not based on our performance, not based on what we've done, but simply and purely based on who we are. This kind of love actually casts out. It expels fear. It drives it out. In a sense, you can think about the fact that it takes up so much space that there's no more room for fear. It's not that fear doesn't exist anymore. Of course it exists, but the love expands so greatly that there's no more room for the fear. It's as if John is saying that God's love is fear repellent. God's love is what we use to actually repel fear. That understanding fear is important, but understanding God's love is even more important. And then a man named Paul, a couple of dozen years after he made this significant change in his life, he wrote something very illustrative about this love. He said, hey, I want to explain to you this love. And this was not this poetic, artistic guy. This guy was kind of a rough guy. He was one of the pioneers of the church, and he had experienced all kinds of challenges. Because of what he believed about Jesus, he had been whipped, beaten, imprisoned. He'd been chained for days and days, months and months. He had been put on trial numerous times. He had been falsely accused of things. He had been shipwrecked in order for him to try to help explain Jesus' love to more people. And then toward the very end of his life, at the very end of the story of the first church that we find in Acts, there's this scene where the Apostle Paul is setting up a campfire. They had been shipwrecked, they had landed on this island, and they're setting up a campfire. And as he's moving some wood to put it on the fire, you know what happens? A snake jumps up out of the wood and bites him. Honestly, I remember reading that for the first time thinking, this guy needs a break, you know? I mean, this guy deserves to catch a break. So he knew what it meant to have a lot of trouble. He knew what it meant to have a lot of fear. He knew what it meant to be scared to death, but he did not allow these fears to control him. No, he found a more powerful agent than the fear. And so he wrote about it in Romans 8. Here's the verses that I just want to read you, a couple of them. Look at what he says. He says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Very simple question. He says, listen, I'm telling you, God's love through Jesus, God's love as seen through Jesus, what he did on the cross and his resurrection from the dead, it was so powerful that it makes me wonder what actually could separate us from the love of Jesus. And then he lists a bunch of stuff. He says, should trouble, should hardship, should persecution, should famine, should nakedness or danger, should any of these? And he continues, he says, no, you know what? As it is written, and he draws something from the past. He says, remember when it was written that for your sake we face death all day long, that we are considered as sheep to be slaughtered? He says, we've risked our life for you. We've overcome death to help you see how great this love is. So what is it that could separate us from this love? Rhetorical question, but in a sense, he says there's nothing. This love is so powerful that there is no fear that could overcome it. Being overwhelmed by God's love is how you overcome fear. He says, no, in all these things, and I love this language, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. We are more than conquerors. And I just want to tell you that today. From those of you who you've been spending sleepless nights worried about something, there's something in the future that you've been fixated on that has been causing fear inside of you. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that your fear is not legitimate, because it is. But what I believe is that you can become more than a conqueror. You can actually be a person that can overcome your fear, yes, by understanding it, but even more than that, by being overwhelmed with the love that God has for us. Let me put it this way. I want to give you some statements about how powerful this love is. Let me specifically give you statements that you can hang on to, that you can latch on to as you start to identify, where does your fear lie? When you think about your fear of death, or your fear of losing your ability to direct your own life, or your fear of being separated from others, or your fear of losing your own ego, I believe God specifically speaks to every one of those. And maybe the the only point to your fear is to point you to God's love. Maybe that the way God wants to redeem your fear, make your fear have a purpose, is to point you to his love. And so maybe this will be a reminder to you that God has a love that's greater than any one of these fears. When it comes to our ego, when it comes to the fear of failure or insignificance or humiliation, God says, hey, I just want to let you know that you matter. You matter. You have worth. You have value. You matter. You may have just recently gone through a divorce. God says, I just want to let you know I'll never file for divorce. I don't care how bad your behavior is. I don't care how crazy your choices are. I will never, ever leave you. If you're single and you're worried about whether or not you have a future just living alone for the rest of your life, God says, you know what? I can't promise you companionship in the future, but I can promise you my companionship. And I'll never leave you. I will never forsake you. I will always be with you. Even if you lost the one you loved, you will never lose the one that loves you most. That's how powerful God's love is. Fear has no reign as long as God's love is reigning in my life. As long as God's love is what's taking up all the space, fear has no room to occupy. Said another way, if God is for me, there's no fear that can rule me. If God's for me, what fear could rule me? The Apostle Paul, who had experienced all kinds of pain in life, he goes, God's love doesn't just barely win. God doesn't just defeat fear. God's love obliterates fear. God's love destroys fear. It's so powerful that fear is deemed completely powerless because of how strong and overwhelming God's love is. See, overcoming fear, it does begin with understanding God's love, but it's more powerful than that. Overcoming fear begins with understanding fear, with understanding God's love, but it also begins with embracing God's love. Have you done that?